welcome to this webinar on security, insecurity, and the Anthropocene. Wherever you are in the world, very welcome. I'm saying good afternoon from Stockholm, but we're also in Brazil, the US, other parts of Sweden, and Australia. And we're here to be discussing the themes which are expressed and explored in this book, Anthropocene Insecurities, published in the autumn of last year. Let me just quickly run through a couple of things and then we'll move straight on to substance. First of all, my name is Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and we're convening this webinar together with the MISTRA Geopolitics program and the Stockholm Environmental Institute. I'm very pleased to be doing so and to be continuing that collaboration, which has been going for several years and has been really, really productive and fruitful. What we're going to have is a series of short presentations on themes from the book. We're then going to have lots of discussion, and I hope that there will be lots of audience input with questions coming in as the slide just before the show started, so to speak, as the slide informed you, questions to be asked through the Q&A function, which you find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our speakers today are, of course, an extremely well-qualified and brilliant crew to be presenting and exploring these topics. I will run through the names and positions now so that I don't have to be breaking up the conversation later on. We have the two of the editors of the book, Eva Löfbrand and Malin Mubjörk. Eva is associate professor, I beg your pardon, Eva, in environmental change at the University of Linköping. And Malin, who used to run our climate change and risk program here at SIPRI, is a senior research officer at the Research Funding Center FORMAS. We have Anthony Burke, who's professor of environmental politics and international relations at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and Stephanie Fischel, lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, which, if you don't mind me saying, Stephanie, is probably the loveliest name for any university that I have ever come across. Marcus King is also with us, the John O. Rankin Associate Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University in the US. Björn-Ola Linnér, who's a professor in environmental change at Linköping University and is Associate Research Fellow at our collaborating institute, Stockholm Environmental Institute. In Brazil, we're being joined by Beatriz Rodrigues Besematos, Assistant Professor in International Relations at the Universidad de Vega de Almeida, and I'm sure that I just massacred the pronunciation of that, but whatever. And we're also going to be joined, or are indeed being joined, by Johanna Lissinger-Peitz, who is the Special Ambassador for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference at the Swedish Ministry of the Environment. As I'm sure this whole audience is aware, the first high-level conference on what at that time was called the human environment was held in Stockholm in 1972, was amongst other things the launching pad for the UN Environmental Programme and for governments having departments of the environment and other things that we now take for granted as a part of contemporary reality. And in June of this year, there will be the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, revisiting those issues. And in my mind, asking the question, how did it come about that we got the world that Stockholm 1972 tried to prevent from happening? And what are we going to do about that? And to kick off this discussion this afternoon, over to Eva Löfbrand and Malin Mubjörk, the editors of this wonderful book. Eva.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, very good. So as Dan kindly introduced here, we'll present a book project that was initiated in November 2019 in view of the upcoming Stockholm Plus 50 celebrations. The journey of this book started just as the COVID-19 pandemic rolled out, and most of the writing took place during a year of extreme heat and wildfires in Australia, California, and Siberia, extensive flooding over large parts of Africa and Asia, severe drought in inner South America, and record low summer ice in the Arctic region. So in this book, we ask what security means in a world marked by these novel landscapes of environmental instability and danger. And indeed, we used the UN Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm in 1972 as a backdrop to our analysis. And as described by Dan, this event, which is also known as the Stockholm Conference, is often described as a starting point for international environmental cooperation, law, and governance. It resulted in a declaration with 26 normative principles that have guided environmental diplomacy ever since, and it also led to the establishment of UNEP as the first global institution devoted to the environment. Now, while our book celebrates the significant diplomatic and institutional achievements made since Stockholm, we also draw attention to the mounting environmental insecurities and inequalities that characterize our present time. So after 50 years of economic globalization and the spread of high consumption lifestyles, we are indeed living through the massive and irreversible harm to the earthly environment that the Stockholm Declaration sought to prevent. And in this book, we use the concept of the Anthropocene as shorthand for these dramatic environmental transformations. And as many of you may know, the Anthropocene is a concept that was coined at the turn of the millennium to describe a new era in planetary history, when the social and economic activities of humankind are disrupting the Earth's life-upholding systems in profound and possibly irreversible ways. It's a concept that confronts us with the dangers of a destabilized biosphere and the apparent failure of our global governance systems to halt the damage done to vulnerable people and ecosystems. Now, the Anthropocene is not an unproblematic starting point for a book. The concept has been widely criticized for its tendency to universalize the human experience, to speak about humanity as one, as a planetary we, and hereby downplaying the vast asymmetries in environmental harm and suffering. But as a provocation, the concept has proven very productive and resulted in intense interdisciplinary debate on what it means to be human on a damaged planet and how security can be achieved in interconnection with the many non-human species upon which our collective survival depends. And it's to this thriving debate that this book tries to speak. So before I hand over to Malin here, I just want to share two questions that have informed our interrogations. So we ask in this volume, what is the role of traditional security concepts, agents, and institutions in a world threatened by rising sea levels, declining freshwater resources, accelerating species loss? And how can our global governance systems respond to the systematic production of environmental risks and the skewed distribution of environmental costs across places, species, and generations? Malin.
Thank you, Eva, for this introduction. And as Eva said, we guided these questions guided our work, but it's important to say that we don't offer any firm answers of these questions. Instead, we tried to foster an interdisciplinary reflections on humanity's relationship to nature, ourselves, and our collective existence. So it's the security concept mobilized in this book are deliberately multiple and diverse, and by its focus on interdependencies and interconnections between social and ecological systems, the Anthropocene calls for new ways of thinking of security. So the scholarly debates are vibrant and include state-centric, human-centric, and earth-centric security notions. And the Anthropocene has also begun to find its way into policy debates, which is illustrated by the last Human Development Report and also a recent special report from UNDP on human security. However, these debates often take place in separate rooms. So with this volume, we sought to encourage a conversation across different scholarly and policy fields, and they gathered an interdisciplinary team of experts to contribute with different angles and perspective on what security and insecurity means in the Anthropocene. And we're immensely grateful for our co-authors' contributions, and soon we will learn more about some of the perspectives that is advanced by our co-authors. So what Eva said, the Anthropocene is describes a new era, and it is the place of dangers to a destabilized biosphere and the failure of global governance. And joined in a mounting sense of crisis, we also conclude this volume with a jointly written afterword. And this afterword proposes principles for actions that may help change the course and safely navigate the global landscape of Anthropocene insecurities. And I will highlight 3 statements taken from this afterword. Although the Anthropocene binds social and ecological worlds together in complex chains of risks and vulnerability, we recognize that any search for security needs to respond to the large asymmetries in causation and suffering. By bringing those most at risk to the forefront of security analysis and governance mechanisms, policies may be steered towards care and solidarity across species, cultures, and generations. Secondly, despite the proliferation of international law and global governance, environmental destruction is continuing. This calls for rethinking in the global environmental governance system. Pollution control mechanisms can limit specific forms of ecological damage, but they neglect how production and consumption decisions are rearranging ecologies on global scales. And new forms of global institutions are needed. And one way forward are by valuing nature differently, not as a resource, but as a home for diverse species, communities, and generations. Third, we need to rapidly decarbonize economies and lifestyles. Climate change or biodiversity loss cannot be reversed. Later cleanup is not an option. Therefore, the rapid decarbonization is key. States, communities, and individuals with a large material and carbon footprint have a particular responsibility to advance a new trajectory towards low carbon and just futures. And children and future generation needs to be adequately represented in decision-making processes that affects their lives. As said, with this volume, we don't search for final solutions. Instead, we try to foster an interdisciplinary debate on security thinking and practice which may advance novel ways of thinking forward. And we hope this book will stimulate debate across diverse policy communities, and the forthcoming celebration of the 50th anniversaries of the Stockholm Conference might become a meeting that help advancing a new language and thinking, which may be translated into hopeful policy trajectory, fostering care and peace. Before entering the next phase in this webinar, we would like to provide our sincere gratitude, first of all, to our co-authors. This volume would not have been possible without your engagement and collaborative spirit. So deep thank you. Second, this book forms part of a research program, Mr. Geopolitics, Sustainable Development in the New Geopolitical Era. We want to extend our thanks to MISTRA, the Swedish Foundation for Strategic and Environmental Research, for the generous financial support and for program fellows in MISTRA Geopolitics. And last but not least, we also want to extend our thanks to SIPRI for helping us to publish this volume in SIPRI Research Report Series, developed in collaboration with Oxford University Press. Thank you all, and I hand over to you, Dan, again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marlin. And for my part as an author, thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in this project. It was really interesting and exciting, and in particular because of the thing that you were saying about the importance of the interdisciplinary discussion and debate. And within that, then, this whole challenge, which you referred to, of valuing nature differently. I think that gives us a quite good segue into the first contribution by the other authors in here in this book, which is coming from Stephanie Fischel and Anthony Burke, who I think in their chapter are asking precisely that question. So I think, Stephanie, it's over to you first and then Anthony's. All right.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thanks to all who made us a part of this project. We think it's really timely and important, especially given what we've been through since 2019 when we began. We're very much looking forward to the conversation today. We'd also like to add that we speak from Australia, from the lands of the Cubby people, in Queensland to the Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and decolonization is not a metaphor. In the Anthropocene, dominant understandings of security are being rethought, especially with growing elite concern with climate security and with the emergence of ecological security as a concept. Yet, as the Ukraine crisis demonstrates, dominant practices of security remain largely unchanged. Throughout the Cold War and in so many contemporary conflicts, fossil fuels can always be found close by. What concepts of security will serve us best now, and what heritages can we draw on? In our chapter, we use the anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration as an opportunity to draw on its enabling possibilities while avoiding its more problematic features. We trace an arc across two important transitions initiated in the 72 conference, from an anthropocentric vision of international environmental law to an earth-centric one, from a state-centric and anthropocentric vision of environmental security to a post-human and ecological one. In some ways, Stockholm no longer serves us well. It speaks of a human Earth rather than a multi-species one, and its Principle 21, state sovereignty over natural resources, cut against the goal of sustainable development and enabled enormous levels of biodiversity destruction across both North and South. Yet Stockholm also made the international environmental law possible and has great normative power. It underscored that if we wish to address poverty and underdevelopment, we cannot choose to harm natural systems. Their collapse will only add to the suffering of those already burdened under human systems. It also explicitly linked human rights to a healthy environment. Then, through the World Charter for Nature and later UN General Assembly resolutions on living in harmony with nature, we can see a gentle rethinking of priorities towards a more ecocentric approach. While Stockholm's strong normative commitment for environmental law to protect human rights, security, and flourishing is a crucial element to the creation of later environmental security regimes, in the Anthropocene, a solely human-centric approach is increasingly inadequate. Humankind cannot stand above or apart from nature, but has become an active force of nature, forcing an integration of social and planetary systems into a global social nature. Our vulnerability is bound up with the Earth system. And I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thanks, Steph. And this strange new landscape of planetary insecurity that we're all talking about is exemplified by the assemblage of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate crises, which link together human encroachment on wildlife, geopolitical competition, environmental racism, and wildfires, floods, and hurricanes into a complex structure of common threats. Just this year, scientists revealed that the Amazon basin has become a net emitter of carbon rather than the Earth's most crucial carbon sink. And that brings catastrophic Earth system tipping points closer, beginning with the loss of tropical rainforest and its transformation into savanna. We argue then for a post-human approach that addresses the crisis by drawing on an ethics of value, entanglement, and kinship across species, cultures, borders, and worlds. We need to acknowledge the intrinsic rights of more than human nature to flourish and exist apart from human use, and its growing power and agency as climate change and biodiversity loss gather speed. So we suggest that three new security concepts, worldly, cosmopolitan, and ecological security, could provide powerful insights towards a path ahead. We need to be alert to harms affecting all beings across the diverse worlds they inhabit and make, to commit to the entangled security of all human beings and ecosystems equally, and to think temporally, both in terms of immediate urgency and geological time, the impacts that will take centuries and millennia to play out, and the impacts coming this year, for which we seem so perpetually ill-prepared. In this situation, it becomes as important to understand our climate trajectory and the state of the Amazon as it is to understand Russia's order of battle around Ukraine. It's important to pressure Bolsonaro to end deforestation in Brazil as it is to pressure Putin to stand down his forces. It becomes as important to negotiate a deforestation treaty as it does a treaty on nuclear non-proliferation. Now, we can understand that in the conventional terms of diplomacy and foreign policy, but what is also needed is a profound transformation of our economic and political systems so that non-human interests become central and that economic growth is decoupled from unsustainable extraction and pollution. As Ava and Marlon argue in the powerful conclusion to this volume, the Anthropocene prompts us to rethink our conceptions and seek security in contestation with the very institutions that are tearing up the biological fabric of the earth. Thank you.
So thank you so very much, both Stephanie and Anthony Burke there. One of the points that Marlon and Eva both emphasized to begin with is the diversity of perspective. And so we shift from one discussion, which is about respecting the multiplicity of species and understanding that humanity, with all our divisions and all that unites us, are not the only inhabitants of this planet whose rights must be respected, to thinking about another set of issues, which is that in one sense, there's no such thing as a purely environmental issue. All environmental issues are also issues about humans' relationship to the environment, and therefore they are governance questions as well. That's not to say one of those angles is more important than the other, but they are both there. And I now want to turn to Marcus King, whose chapter in the book is to do with closing the governance gaps in climate security, or in thinking about climate security. And Marcus, over to you.
Thank you so much. So the title of our chapter is Responsibility to Prepare and Prevent, also known as R2P, and closing these climate security governance gaps. First, I want to acknowledge that the chapter is co-authored by Frank Femia and Caitlin Worrell from the Center for Climate and Security. The Center for Climate Security is an organization that envisions a climate resilient world while recognizing climate threats to security are significant, unprecedented, and potentially existential as we move through the century, and adds to those threats in a manner that is commensurate with our scale, the consequence, and the probability of these events. So together in the chapter, we propose that climate security, as referring to security risks induced directly or indirectly by changes in climate patterns, are indeed the foremost issue as we enter the next stages of the climate crisis. So our work is based on the assumption that societal instability brought about by the impacts of climate change poses unacceptable risk to both human and national security in the Anthropocene. So to state the obvious, the window of opportunity to strengthen global climate security governance is narrowing, so new approaches must be considered. But our first and foremost point is that existing institutions have the capacity to facilitate better climate security decision-making. So state-centered security and scientific organizations in the global north particularly already have the data and the unprecedented foresight capabilities that increase humanity's chances of mounting an appropriate response to the climate-induced risks. These organizations include multinational security organizations such as NATO, formed between countries, and the UN Security Council within the UN, and might I add, the specialized agencies. Science-based agencies such as those for space exploration and atmospheric agencies, of course, would be included in this. So these organizations are leaders in areas such as remote sensing, high-speed computer power necessary to develop accurate models. The capacities that are resident in these organizations can be leveraged to address climate security risks humanely and systematically at the national, regional, and indeed global levels. So our point is that low probability events do happen all the time, but now the ability of climate models to project the implications of these low probability events is increasing, which means there's increasing capacity to prepare and to prevent them with significant advance notice that we have. So in our view, this creates a civic international responsibility. This is a principle that builds upon the moral foundation of the responsibility to protect principle on mass atrocity prevention and response. The R2P concept builds upon a recommitment to this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that's within the UN Nation Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it should be elsewhere. So complex transnational and cross-sectoral nature of climate risks demands consideration of a comprehensive approach to climate security. And we ground that approach in what we consider to be practical given the current global political structures. You might call this approach, and some have, eco-realism. In this volume and elsewhere, many scholars have contended that in a highly connected and risky world, neither state-centric representations of global space nor traditional security thinking is now analytically or politically relevant. And this is very forward-looking, and I believe probably the case as we proceed through the decades to come. But we situate our chapter in this frame of international relations, which is the theory of liberal institutionalism, meaning that global approaches to achieving climate security can be achieved within our existing governance framework. So we contend that international and multinational organizations, such as the UN, have the potential to increase aid and cooperation among states. This is assuming that institutions must not be reinvented, but there are gaps that must be addressed to achieve a satisfactory outcome. And that first gap is a gap in leadership, and that's identifying and holding those responsible for preparedness and prevention to account. An accountability to address climate security risks that must be felt at the highest levels of national governments. For example, in the United States, the treatment of climate as so-called low politics as an environmental issue in the past has contributed to a lack of urgency or prioritization compared to other traditional threats to security. These threats include nuclear proliferation, international terrorism, for example. But unlike with these other significant security risks, such as nuclear weapons proliferation, there are fewer security organizations that champion climate and security, and still fewer that would prioritize it. Climate security governments must be assigned a clear responsibility for climate policy within the bureaucracy. And the historical demarcation of climate risks as primarily an environmental concern or a scientific problem means that climate information has not been tailored to global security decision makers situated in ministries of defense, intelligence, or foreign affairs. This means public officials who are responsible for formulating and implementing peace and security policy are often bureaucratically shielded from the very decisions related to managing the adverse impacts of climate change. Our second gap that we've identified is the need to provide actionable information for security policymakers. There's an endless amount of data measuring the implications of climate change on food, water, and energy systems, and this data grows exponentially. However, officials in positions of responsibility for national security who manage the security implications of these changes, which are of course social and political in nature, need information at the necessary scale and granularity to be actionable. This leads to another issue, which is the lack of standardized global metrics for climate security risk and how to understand these. Information is available, but there's so much information evolving so quickly that it can create policy paralysis. This is the case for security practitioners for whom sufficient tools and guidance for managing and interpreting and judging environmental information as opposed to battlefield information do not necessarily exist. So we call for a global hub of standardized, authoritative climate security information as much as possible, that we can achieve social science consensus on the issue, and that we better understand the significant relationships in the climate security nexus. So this includes the relationship between climate and conflict, climate and state fragility, and that presents credible climate security futures. So dealing with these futures, another gap is the lack of future projections in a field that is dominated by empirical data. Government actors require credible future projections to enact policies to address these risks, but mainly have access only to the forensic climate security analysis that has come before, most of which is narrowly focused on exploring climate conflict linkages. Some national intelligence and defense communities have filled the gap by conducting climate scenarios and threat assessments and communicating these assessments to their respective governments. But this has really been a characteristic of security policies in decision makings in the global north. So the countries in the global north can catalyze these approaches and be more transparent in sharing the results. And these gaps we've identified point to the need for a governing body devoted to facilitating alignment and coordination of these gaps. This body would need to include coordinating mechanisms to climate risks through international mechanisms such as the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, along with actions on climate relevant security problems and prevention, including resolutions in the UN Security Council. So coordination should not be limited to institutions such as the UNFCCC, but we believe that in the Anthropocene, the international community would be well advised to begin in earnest the process of establishing our so-called R2P framework. And this framework must bring those at most at risk to the forefront of global governance. The international community has the responsibility to prepare and prevent all living beings from the dangers of a rapidly warming world. This requires global governance mechanisms that channel scientific knowledge on risks and vulnerability, but also listen to and learn from the communities that are most at risk.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you. And I think that the diversity and the range of approaches and thinking that we were talking about at the beginning is well demonstrated here. The profound rethinking that the current planetary emergency requires from us, rethinking of where we stand in relation to the nature of which we're a part. And at the same time, the pragmatism that's needed to get traction for change in the current environment. And reference has been made to the situation with Ukraine, and one could think of others as well. And in part, these bring us to a question that I think Anthony referred to explicitly, which is the balance between the balance of priorities of the hard security issues, the traditional ones, and of the new full range of security issues, which we're talking about in this book. And I think that brings us then quite neatly to Beatrice and to the question of whose security and whose insecurity we're thinking about, which is the core of your chapter. So over to you, Beatrice, please.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel and have the opportunity to discuss the book with all of you. With this chapter, Sebastian and I aimed to present alternative narratives and sources of insecurity arising from the emergency of the Anthropocene. We argue that the global environmental crisis may provoke and shift the discussion around other ways of thinking about and experiencing insecurity. So through the analysis of the case of the Marshall Islands, located in the region of Micronesia in the Pacific, we aimed to bring to the forefront marginalized narratives from human communities which do not configure as the protagonists of the Anthropocene, but feel severely threatened by the climate challenges enhanced by this new era. So as a theoretical background, we employ the concept of ontological security to frame security as a condition that relates not only to the protection of physical bodies, but also to the stability of self-identities. Anthony Giddens associates the condition of ontological security to the preservation of social and material environments of action and a sense of biographical continuity. Within the field of international security studies, ontological security was defined as the desire and urge of a social actor to survive and surpass, not only as a physical identity, but also as a certain sort of social being. So the Marshall Islands are a tragic example of how these traditional and non-traditional threats can be destructive when it comes to physical and ontological security. Marshallese territories, ecosystems, customs, and cosmologies are affected both by traditional security practices and by the current environmental crisis. The archipelago is one of the most vulnerable to global environmental effects. During the Cold War, the Marshall Islands was the stage of 67 thermonuclear tests. These violent experiments forced the permanent evacuation of entire communities from their ancestral atolls and resulted in severe psychological and health problems. Nowadays, the Marshallese Islands and the community's traditional ways of life are once again being challenged. It's very likely that the archipelago becomes inhospitable in the near future. The atolls and nature in general are considered a crucial part of the islanders' local identities. Together with their names, they used to present themselves as a person from a specific atoll. And according to local beliefs, to find peace after death, the deceased must be buried at the same atoll they were born. However, climate change has caused honoring these traditions to become an increasingly difficult task. Some of the Marshallese atolls are already submerged, and graves are threatened to be swept into the ocean. Thus, the consequences of the Anthropocene are interpreted as a source of deep social, spiritual, and cultural insecurity that go beyond physical annihilation. Thus, differently from traditional interpretations on security, local narratives point to, as their primary referent object to be protected, a condition of harmony and completeness derived from the connection between the islanders and their natural surroundings. Throughout the analysis of this case, we have argued for alternative meanings of security and for a critical examination of the ontologies, practices, and rationalities that characterize the theoretical and the political fields of security. On the one hand, the Marshallese nuclear past helps to expose the inadequacy and perils of traditional security rationalities and practices. On the other, having nature both as part of their self-identity and as a threat, the local security narratives challenge the modern and artificial dichotomy between humanity and nature. It is an illustrative example of how referent objects and threats become blurred during the Anthropocene era. So for the reasons we stated above, we come to the conclusion that it's our challenge, it's our urgent challenge as scholars to engage and learn from communities from the global south who strive for survival in this unpredictable and unknown world. Thank you very much, and I am looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you very much to all of the authors for those presentations. Each one angled towards a different target, if you like, for want of a better expression. Each one raising a different but related set of issues. And I want to turn now in the conversation, first of all, to Johanna Lissinger-Peitz, who has got a special responsibility in the preparation of the Stockholm +50 conference coming up in June of this year, and then to Björn Linnér, and then I will have some questions and thoughts for the panelists to come back. And Johanna, I mean, we know, of course, that the Stockholm +50 conference, in many ways, it's the inheritor of the original Stockholm Conference, the Rio Conference, the follow-ons from there as well. During those many years of discussion about the environment, those of us who have understood a peace and security linkage to questions of environmental deterioration and environmental challenge, including climate change, have often found ourselves on the side trying to get the attention of the environmental community to, could you please understand that these impacts upon society will be serious and they may involve instability, and if they're not managed properly, it could get worse and worse and worse. And I feel that that debate has been moving forward. But this set of issues, which is looked at in this book from these different angles, to what degree do you either hope or think, or both, think that they might be addressed during or around the Stockholm Plus 50 conference this year? You're muted.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that. And let me just also thank all of the speakers. Setting up the scene and presenting their different chapters has been really, really interesting. I think somehow if you actually look at the full title for, we talk about Stockholm Plus 50, but the title is actually A Healthy Planet for the Prosperity of All, Our Responsibility, Our Opportunity. So if I would give a 30-second response to your question, if what we have been talking here is connected to Stockholm Plus 50 in June, I think the headline is actually giving you the answer, because we cannot have a healthy planet and prosperity for all, and we cannot take our responsibility and use the opportunity if we are not looking at the connecting issues, at the climate security, but also environment peace building issues together. And I also think that with Stockholm Plus 50, it's a meeting that is different in nature. It has a very wide mandate, and some days I think that's the greatest opportunities. There are also some days that I think that is the biggest challenges, because in that wide mandate, we have to think about where can we actually make a difference. And I think it was maybe Malin who spoke in the beginning who said, can we use Stockholm Plus 50 and meetings around Stockholm Plus 50 to foster a new language and a new thinkings for solutions for new language and new thinking around what we have been discussing here today. And I believe that's a very good ambition, because it's a short meeting, it's a 2-day meeting, so we can't do it all. But if together, and of course this community plays an essential role there, between now and June 2022, we can work together to foster that new language and new thinking, I think we can achieve something. I also just wanted to make one personal reflection in the sense of, how you started your introduction with saying, from the side of coming from maybe the security issues, having been standing in some of the meetings talking to people who work with the environment side and saying, you have to look at these issues. And I just find it quite interesting, and I've been reflecting about this quite a lot recently, that while I have been working with multilateral environment and climate issues for almost 15 years, it's not until I started this position with Stockholm Plus 50 that I have actually been drawn into the nexus of these issues. And I find that quite interesting. And in often the different meetings when I participate, and I can't of course see the full participation list, but I do notice that at least among the speakers, many comes from the field of peace and security. I come from the field of environment, and I think finding more places where we can actually meet with a greater mix and having those conversations will be key. And I do think Stockholm could provide such an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johanna. I think that's really interesting, that idea that there is now a greater intersection. There are more meeting points. And I should probably have said, that those of us who have been feeling frustrated of not being heard as well as we would like to be heard on the security environment side amongst environmentalists, feel, frankly, the same frustration towards the peace and security side. I mean, the problem is thinking of things in boxes and in silos and in failing to make those connections. Now, Björn-Ola, I want to turn to you, if I may. And I'm sorry, folks, if you see me looking at what seems like the ceiling now, it's because Björn-Ola is in the top right-hand corner of my screen. And we encountered each other first very much in the process of trying to get this meeting between different constituencies, different communities of thought and practice to get going in the Mistra Geopolitics. We were there together designing the program some years back. What's your reflection on how far things have moved since, was that 2016 when we were in the summer of 2016 when I was talking to you from the summer place on the West Coast and we were trying to get the application done in the deadline? What's your reflection about how far we've moved in that 5.5 years?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that the realization that the geopolitics of sustainability really matters, and not only that it can provide hindrances to the ambitions in the Paris Agreement or the 2030 agenda. It's much more recognized today. And not least opportunities. I would say, I don't know if you remember, but this autumn, just before COP26, the China's foreign minister Wang Yi said that the climate negotiations or the climate discussions between China and the US is an oasis in a very otherwise very strained relationship between the countries. And they also came up with this joint platform at COP26. So in that respect, I think at least the issues are much more recognized. But of course, it's also striking to see that one of the most prominent features of the Stockholm Conference, that it was so much focused on disarmament and peace issues, and the language of the declaration and the discussions, that's so much focus on peace and security. And we don't really see that since then in the international meetings on environment, climate, development, and well, Johanna can answer what the focus is on the Stockholm Plus 50, but I haven't seen it there either, which is interesting, especially in a time in Europe when peace in Europe seems to be hanging by a thread.
I mean, one could look at this in a sort of, historical process, right, and say, well, in the late 60s, early 70s, when the Stockholm 1972 conference was being conceived, designed, and first convened, the Cold War was the big thing. The arms race was the big thing. This was the East-West world. I mean, SIPRI was established as a peace research institute in 1966, and clearly its big focus was East-West. And what was needed in 1972 was to, in a sense, take the environment seriously. Right? And that's been the process that has been established. But you get institutional path dependency, in which those who rightly won and celebrate the winning of taking the environment seriously, then only take the environment seriously. And whereas what we need is more linkage. Johanna, I'm not asking you to give away any secrets about the preparation of Stockholm Plus 50, but do you think it is reasonable to hope that perhaps looking at it slightly more broadly with Stockholm Plus 50 and COP27 in Egypt coming up later in the year, that there can be some further movement of, how to put it, enlarging that oasis in which cooperative international politics is possible, at least on this set of issues, even if other aspects of the geopolitical reality are remaining worrying, to say the least?
No, but thank you for the question. And yes, I do think there's an opportunity, but looking at the process of, how multilateral meeting works, it is very much a co-creation, bottom-up driven process. So that will require that, a sufficient amount of organizations, stakeholders, member states is actually bringing this issue to the agenda. With the mandate that we have for Stockholm, the opportunity, I would say, is definitely there. But we also have a very clear, I think, signal from member states and others that it's the opportunity for all of them to fill it with content. We have 3 leaderships dialogues that we will be looking at. The first one is very much about reflecting of the urgency of action for a healthy planet for all. I definitely think there is an opportunity to put these discussions into that leadership dialogue. We were looking at sustainable recovery. We were looking at implementation. And we know, I think, that we are not going to succeed with implementation and create someone spoke earlier about the important conditions, enabling conditions for implementation, if we are not looking at the bigger agenda also. So I think from us as one of the co-hosts in this, we also of course have Kenya as an important partner to us here as a co-host. The opportunity is there, but it needs to also be brought into the process by those who are actively participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Johanna. And Björn-Ola, back to you relatively quickly. Is there some kind of, headline slogan almost that you would like to see coming out, again, set more broadly, not just Stockholm plus 50, but Stockholm plus 50 and COP27 in Egypt later this year, that would, for you, register some kind of achievement, some not necessarily tangible and concrete in a policy sense, but at least a step forward in consciousness and in willingness to address these problems? Is there something that you can, conceive of happening, which you would say, yes, at least we got that?
Well, I think that happens all the time. I'm trying to think of a one-liner. I fail at the moment, but I think we need to recognize that these meetings are extremely important in constantly providing momentum. Every time we have an international meeting, we are disappointed because we didn't achieve the aspiring goals, but they constantly work as a catalyst. And we can see that after every of these major meetings that we have after Stockholm, the Stockholm Conference, just before the Stockholm Conference, we had the first environment ministry in the UK, 5 years later, 20. And the same process repeats after Rio, but we had 40 and then up to 103 after the conference, just in ministries. We see that as a sign how the institutionalization, but also that these meetings works as a catalyst. And also, we should also, I hope I'm not speaking too long here, recognize that they're both providing this platform for collaboration between countries, but also forming important alliances internationally. And I think Stockholm should be, as Tim Campbell, the World Bank economist, said just a year after the Stockholm Conference, should be recognized not so much for its environmental and scientific achievements as its ability to provide new political alliances. And we can see, for instance, the forming of South collaboration after Stockholm has been extremely important for driving the sustainable development agenda, linking environment and development. Okay, I'm not really answering your questions here, but I think those type of catalyst that goes on, it's not to say, okay, we achieved it. It's rather the process.
Yeah, sometimes the question doesn't need to be answered, Björn-Ola. That was I think you helped us understand what the needs and challenges are in this kind of international conference and so on. Now, Eva, Malin, Stephanie, and Anthony, I want to ask all four of you the same question, if I may. So, Eva, you're getting least notice, and Anthony is getting longest notice of it. And it's something particular that Marcus said during the course of his presentation, which was his idea, which I find quite interesting and challenging. And I'm not sure what I think about it, so I want you to help enlighten me as to whether there could be indeed a kind of a social science consensus about, I guess, the linkages between climate and presumably other environmental issues, security questions, and governance. If there's something there that it's possible to think of, an authoritative global standard that this is the way, this is the approach, or would you argue in favor of diversity and perhaps non-linear thinking that in fact that would be to go down the wrong path? So I'm offering you a wide range of choice, but you can also, like Björn-Ola did, choose not to answer the question as long as you say something interesting about it. So Eva, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that challenge. As a social scientist myself, I know that consensus is hard to achieve in our interdisciplinary sort of scholarly field. I think, to me, and perhaps here comes a reflection in view of the Anthropocene framing of this book. Many have asked me previously whether we should, what this notion of the Anthropocene is doing to our thinking around in this case, security and global politics? Is it indeed a fruitful framing? And obviously there are many problems with this concept. But I think, to me, the very fact that we disagree is indeed what makes it productive and useful. I think this is a concept that has generated a lot of interdisciplinary debate that is now indeed pushing our thinking around global governance and institution building. And it's not providing a new language in the terms that we all agree what needs to be done, but I think it's working as a provocation for new ways of thinking about these matters. So to me, disagreement is actually more productive than consensus and agreement. But that's the privilege of the academic to say that, of course, that we can continue to problematize these questions, whereas others have to sort of move on and find solutions.
Malin.
Thank you. No, I think I will not answer directly your question. Rather, I would like to emphasize this with the balancing, that we have current systems, we have current political realities, and we need to move and within those, but at the same time challenge those because they have also failed. And I think we need to, at the same time, question them deeply, at the same time as we try to change them from inside, but also from outside. So I also would refrain from this consensus thinking. I think we need this diversity, which we also wanted to achieve with this book, because we need to connect the changes within the system with also really questioning the fundamental basis in some of our presumptions in our system. So I think it is to find this balance between us and find the respectful conversation and help our way forward in also being able to develop new forms of arenas and trajectories. So yeah, I would stop there.
Okay, I mean, I think that the challenge which you both then faced is about thinking and discussing is one thing, doing is another, and how you bridge that. I don't know whether Stephanie and Anthony are going to be able to address that at all as they ponder this question, but Stephanie, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Dan. That's a great provocation. I think in some ways that's a dichotomy of either choosing consensus or argument or global v local, and that traps us in the same kind of thinking we've been having some problems with. I'm never really certain about balanced metaphors. I'm not really sure how they work. They certainly don't work that well with the balance of power in international relations, for those of you who are familiar with that old chestnut. So I kind of answer along a different line to say that maybe what we need to do is to be able to communicate complex issues a little better. So part of the doing also comes with SciComm, and I think that is where we tend to fall short, that the scientists have done the studies and have been not as successful as we would have liked to be able to communicate the urgency of said findings into the political realm and into the realm of action. So these complex issues don't necessarily lend themselves to these easy ways of making lists and responding, which is one of the reasons why responsibility to protect wants to oftentimes list the ways in which we would intervene in humanitarian crises, but these crises always kind of slip from our fingers in the ways that we can understand them and communicate them. So I guess shortly to answer you is, should there be consensus? I don't know, but maybe a way to communicate these things to the relevant people that need to be making decisions about it, and that's going to be a very local issue, I think is really important at this point.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And Anthony Burke, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. We saw the pitfalls of the consensus model in the last hour at Glasgow. But thinking about it, I wonder if we need consensus around core facts and then disagreement about what to do with them and, beyond them is just unavoidable. And we have to try and enter into that disagreement in good faith and to listen, but also be willing to make our point of view from wherever we sit, because they're all important. The area where this is troubling me the most at the moment is around what is the safe carbon budget to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and even getting consensus in the UNCCC about 1.5 has not been easy. But I think we can say that's a settled goal now. But you have John Kerry saying, you know, the Biden administration is going to achieve net zero by 2050, and the EU has said the same, and so many countries have said this. But this was a budget developed in 2017 or 18, published in the 1.5C report, and we've emitted probably 150 to 170 gigatons of carbon since then. It's been taken out of the budget, but everyone's talking about a trajectory that is illusory and dangerous. So if we're worried about environmental intelligence, and I really liked Marco's comments there, it's just, can we agree on this core central question?
So, Marcus, in your chapter, you probably found yourself having to summarize a complex issue in fewer words than you would like. I too face the discipline of editors leaning in on me and saying, you got to say it quicker. And then in your remarks, you summarized it a bit more. And then in my putting the question, I brutally summarized it. But what's your response on this? And I thought particularly interesting was not just the idea that diverse opinion is good, but that there could be some kind of consensus around something we call fact. And then beyond that, the diversity is A, unavoidable, and B, may be welcome, because only through the diversity you get progress forward in thinking. Anyway, back to you, Marcus. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that there's sort of two areas where this could be considered. And first would be in the academy. So in the academy, you have this dichotomy between the fact of the physical science and how the physical science can then lead to the understanding within the social sciences of the socio-political impacts and effects, and how to find these connections in the academy, which is very segregated in terms of disciplines. So it really has to be an interdisciplinary approach. And then again, when you look at the policy world, there's the same dilemma in a sense, because you have the hopefully the consensus around the scientific fact or the basic facts of what we need to drive to, but then the policymakers that have the various views and the various approaches from the different countries, and so I see those as being very related.
Great, thank you very much. Well, now I want to change gear and come over to Beatrice. And one of the questions that has come up through the Q&A that audience members have put in is a concern that maybe thinking about the Anthropocene, and I suppose you could say this whole set of issues, can somehow drown out or perhaps overwhelm thinking about the real hard power dynamics which exist. And I think that it's not just to be thinking about what we often call hard security, and therefore to be thinking about, Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever. It's thinking about power dynamics within societies. It's thinking about that not everybody either suffers or benefits to the same degree, either from the impact of environmental deterioration or from mitigating environmental deterioration. Now, in your remarks and in your chapter, you were talking about the Marshall Islanders. You were talking about a highly marginalized, excluded, pressed upon group of people for whom that record of 67 thermonuclear tests is not only psychological scars, but a permanent environmental risk, because there is a massive dome into which all of the radioactive waste from the Marshall Islands has been put. And it's been kept there in a dome, which, of course, like everything else, is subject to the impact and the pressures of climate change. So you drew our attention to this question of inequality, unequal access to power. Take us a little bit further through that conversation, if you can, related to thinking about it in the specific contours of the Anthropocene epoch. You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you very much for the very interesting and provoking question. I was wondering, I believe that this is an urgent, pressing issue, an urgent issue, but the co-authors have stressed in their chapters that the state-centric dynamics is not enough to address the needs of the more vulnerable populations. We can see it during the multilateral negotiations, the UNFCCC. In Brazil, for example, we can see clearly that the governmental positions are totally against the traditional people's needs and rights. So I agree that we have to balance the power dynamics, and not only in the multilateral negotiations, but also inside the countries with more democratic institutions or democratic channels of dialogue. So, but at the same time, I believe that it's an increasingly hard process. I think that we are starting this process within the biological diversity negotiations, for example, where indigenous and traditional people have a seat during the talks, during the negotiations. Of course, these measures alone, they do not guarantee that we will not have cooptation and another sort of problems. But I think that this process that is starting within the international organizations, the international governance, it could raise a lot of provocations, and maybe to create different channels of dialogue between and amongst these different actors. But yeah, it's a very challenging issue, and we have a lot of the academia, I think, have a lot of think about this inequality and this imbalance of power. So thank you for the question.
Thanks very much, Beatrice. And Björn-Ola, what are your reflections on the same set of questions? The balance, well, not the balance, the power dynamics in relation to the challenges that the Anthropocene era sets us, both in terms of communities and societies, and also perhaps with more focus on international.
Okay, yeah, I think that's the key issue, isn't it? We clearly saw that at COP26, and we've seen that through all the how the political economy of the world and the geopolitical balance also constantly put its imprint on the environmental and sustainability issues. And I think this is reflected in the constant struggle to gain more from low-income countries, to put pressure on the richer countries for more funding in support of the loss and damage function, for instance, which I know Beatrice is working on, for instance, clearly and constantly coming up with being disappointed to all the promises that have been made by the richer countries. So there is, of course, clearly a struggle here over the international political economy, which puts the imprint already from the Stockholm Conference. I mean, that was the main contested issue, which almost sacked the whole conference before it started. And after the conference, there was new initiatives like the new international economic order. I don't know if you are, maybe most of you are too young to remember this, but that was one of the core issues in the United Nations, and also the General Assembly finally agreeing on that we needed a new international economic order. Nothing happened, of course, after that, as we are aware of, but that those issues are at the front and that we need to address them to gain progress in international collaboration. I think that's essential. And if you ask me for the one-liner, it's still not a one-liner, but if I would like to see something that has appeared that clearly have shown that I will be optimistic in progress, that will be that we finally address the economic inequalities in the world, but there is no signs of that yet.
I mean, unfortunately, there was a new international economic order that started reasonably soon after the 1972 Stockholm Conference. It's just that it was more unequal, more unfair, more unjust, created more profits, more billionaires, more and so on, than what had gone before. And I mean, this is the sad thing, that when you look at the statistics of inequality, and in many countries, not all, but in many countries, they were improving by the mid-1970s, since when there has been a deterioration. And that's being tracked now in detail in the last few years, and it still continues. I think the other aspect of power dynamics that is also interesting to think about is just subsidies for fossil fuels. I mean, there is a total imbalance of power there. The figures are contested, but I mean, direct and indirect subsidies are calculated by the IMF to be somewhere up towards $6 trillion a year in subsidizing fossil fuel industries. And it's just extraordinary that so much of our resources are put into an activity or a set of activities that we know to be damaging.
But that has another implication, I think, also, which really speaks about the problem, because a lot of these subsidies, not all, but some of them, especially like if you look at a country like India, a lot of them are directed to keep the coal prices affordable for the poor. So we get sort of the inequality in the world again hitting us back, because it's an excuse to keep the fossil fuel subsidies. So the poorer population use that as an excuse to keep the carbon at a low price, but it's really about addressing the inequalities.
Because you could actually be making another choice about what forms of energy you want to keep cheap, so that poor people have access to them. There is a specific question in the that has come up in the Q&A, which I want to put out, and put up your hand. There's few enough of you that I can see your physical hand if you raise it. You don't need to turn to the electronic one. It's about how African countries can key into this approach, because as the questioner says, it seems the issue of climate change and the Anthropocene is more reflective about thinking in European countries, North America, and although the questioner doesn't say it, other advanced countries, including Australia. So, and yet the effects are particularly strong in Africa. So, yes, challenge out just for any one of you to pick up. What might be the ways in, the routes in, for African countries, for people in African countries to be thinking about, active about generating policy on new approaches around the challenge of the Anthropocene and the new insecurities that it throws up? My challenge to you all, one of you needs to put your hand up or I'm going to look pretty dumb, and I don't like that. Yeah, Anthony, please save me. Thank you. And then Stephanie.
I mean, obviously we're not in a position to speak for Africa or Africans here, but in the Planet Politics Institute, we had an African climate activist and NGO worker, Adeniki Oladasu, write for our blog. She writes about Lake Chad and climate security and conflict. One thing we haven't probably touched on so much tonight, but is strong in the book, which is the human security, the importance of that frame and the way it can bridge the environment and ecology quite nicely. And in her work and her thinking, I'm seeing those two things enmeshed already. So I think Africans intuitively understand much better that in many ways, and I think it's the way they're enmeshed, and I think that's true of the South Pacific and the Marshalls, which is why it's so great to hear that story. And to me, there are power relations, say in a country like Nigeria, which has been such a strong oil producer over time and had so much conflict internally. So it's a matter of listening and perhaps trying to help African security institutions like the AU, build its work in this space.
Thank you, Anthony. And Stephanie, you also indicate.
I think there's probably an incredible, rich and amazing history and contemporary thinking about all of these issues. There's just a problem with the avenues of getting those to other places. So I don't think what can be supported is, again, something that in two ways, I think we can talk about putting the most vulnerable first, which is really important, because, as Cornel West would say, an American theorist, if you put them first, the other people will get fixed right now, right? So you do the we fix those problems idea. And there's also, I think, the powerful notion that, along with Nigeria being a really an oil-producing country that's been filled with conflict, it also had Ken Saro-Wiwa and an amazing tradition of pushing back against these kind of things that happened at the same time. So I think those are the really important things, no more like what there is plenty there. And I know just from our discipline and knowing African scholars, they're often cut out at the disciplinary level as if they're too much talk of Africa at our conferences, and so they won't get their panels put on. So there's an interesting way in which this is reflected at the institutional and academic, which I think we need to get out of the way and let the amazing thinkers and traditions that are coming out of other places be front and center. And there's plenty there.
Thanks very much for that, Stephanie. And I see Johanna's hand as well.
No, thank you very much. And maybe responding from a slightly different perspective, but I'm also just thinking that Africa, I think right now, have the youngest population of all the different regions. And we haven't spoken about that so much, but actually bringing in the youth as innovators, as contributors to solution, but also because I think from my experience, at least, when we also talk with the youth, many of us who have worked in different fields, we have entered into our silos. When we have the conversations with the youth, they're also sometimes much better to bringing in the nexus and the more holistic issues. So just wanted to bring that in as one important key point. And just another reflection based on early conversations, I think for Stockholm Plus 50, we really want to see that as an accelerator of issues. So built on what has been said here today, if one can find that, that one-liner, that field, where would Stockholm be able to make a difference to this year on the issues being discussed here today, I think that would be a very good outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johanna. I think that we've come to the question of voice and inclusion, which I think is really extraordinarily important in this. I mean, we face the crisis which we're facing is a combination of the planetary crisis, or planetary emergency, however one wants to express it, the security horizon, which looks extremely bleak, with toxic geopolitics, and not just Ukraine and Taiwan, but flashpoints elsewhere as well, and a set of problems around governance, which is often, when we talk about it in this context, understood to be something at the global level and rather abstract, but I mean it kind of all the way through and all the way down. And one of the important things I think that has happened to give one hope is not just in terms of youth, not just the Fridays for the Future movement, which I think is wonderful in every way, but in Sudan, right? Climate change and the impact of climate change has become a major political issue in the transition at the moment, has been put there by the youth movements. And as a result, the Sudanese delegation at the COP26 had participants, activists from the youth movement in the formal delegation, so that the issue is beginning to move. It is beginning to change in that kind of way. Different aspects of this combined complex crisis being addressed. Now, we're coming towards the end. I'm afraid time is always the enemy in a discussion like this. You get a really good discussion going. You pick up some good issues. For those of you who've been asking in the Q&A, this session is being recorded and it will then be edited. So all the non-smooth bits, all the mistakes from the moderator, for example, will be nicely edited out, and a good version will be up on YouTube in the coming period, really quite soon. But the way that I want to finish now is to give each of the panelists, including Björn Ola as well, 1 minute for your closing reflection on what we've just been talking about. I told you earlier on that it's the average speed of speaking in English for a newsreader or somebody like that is 3 words per second. So your 180 words in the sun. Eva, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, there's so much to say, but perhaps picking up on this question of how a book like this can contribute and what it sort of offers to those who are trying to sort of move forward with the global governance agenda in this field. Well, I think in a way that the Anthropocene framing can offer a new language and a new way of thinking around the nexus of environment, security, and global life. But it's not a comfortable concept. It's not a concept that comes with solutions. It doesn't offer a blueprint for action. And it's very unsettling as opposed to more familiar concepts like sustainable development that we have sort of used to organize international environment cooperation around during the past 20 years. And I think there is reason to stay with the trouble here and use this moment to sort of both recognize what the fundamental sort of dangers that we are facing as we are transforming the global environment, but also in that moment see streams of hope and perhaps to me the hopeful and promising ways forward would really be to bring forward those communities most at risk and give them a voice in this conversation. And sometimes I worry that the Anthropocene language doesn't help. It sort of excludes more than it sort of invites those voices. But I think that to bring the youth, to bring the indigenous communities, but all those who are suffering and are vulnerable to the unfolding environmental change to the fore of global affairs is really what we should strive for.
Yeah, voice and inclusion. I think I agree with you very, very strongly. Malin.
Thank you. Now, I would like to conclude that I despite the really current stress factors in all kinds of areas on environmental degradation, climate change, security, the geopolitical tensions and all inequalities. At the same time, I also notice that there's also such a much more increasing attention to focus on these things and also to bring them in together, to see that these issues and challenges are actually connected to each other. So I also feel that there's some form of hope in sense that we also start to think of these challenges as connected to each other, that they need to be dealt with in a different forms. And I think that is also inspiring. And also this with the youth dimension, and which has been also come up so much stronger. And also you notice different ways in which you try to bring in the youth dimension in the future perspectives into policy discussions, scholar debates, and so on. So that's also hopeful. So I would like to conclude with that. Thank you.
Malin, thank you very much. And Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks for the great way to end. I guess I'll talk just two. One is like the fancy way to say that the Anthropocene, rather than being an ontology, we could think of it as an epistemology. Therefore, it takes some of the weight out of defining who we are through this planetary realization, rather thinking about the kinds of forms of knowledge we need in which to move from our Holocene institutions to Anthropocene institutions. And that moves into kind of the second, a bit more cheeky answer is like, we can name it later, right? That the good, the contestation is good. And I hear Eva and Malin and turning off people are not able to open up conversations. We need activists because, right, if you do policy studies, you know the best policies always come from people pushing the politicians and knowing what they want and need. So we need to have a reinvigoration of our creativity and of our ability to think about these forms of institutions we need going into the Anthropocene that's markedly different than the Holocene. Democracy, education, Rosie Braidati's blue humanities and green humanities, right? That we need to move out of the way we even see ourselves in our disciplines to be able to respond to this.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And over to Anthony.
Yeah, I was thinking of a report Greenpeace Asia Pacific put out last year about Australia's bullying climate diplomacy in the Pacific. And I remember one of the points of that is that we apparently were really pushing against efforts to make climate security a headline issue, pushing back against the Boy Declaration, and with it a whole bunch of social justice questions and human rights questions that come in with it. And there's a question in the chat about Myanmar and how do you cope when you have a level of repression there that is also enabling environmental destruction and community displacement. So I think there's a matter where talking about climate security is not actually depoliticizing. It's a highly political and contested space. And the really important thing is, you know, we need to listen to the Earth, and we've got to listen to the marginalized and the struggling in the global South.
Yes, and I think when you raise it, when you mention Myanmar, and I also had seen that question in the Q&A, it's a very useful and important one. You think about Myanmar, and you also think about then the way in which those who are marginalized get ignored when there is a major, worse than ignored, when there is a major catastrophe like Cyclone Nagai some years back. Marcus, your turn.
Yeah, so I think that the Anthropocene presents a extreme sense of urgency, and that urgency is to pick up on strains of existing multilateral processes and traditions. And so the first, of course, is the responsibility to prevent atrocities. And then second would be, again, the reinvigoration of common but differentiated responsibilities to really amplify the voices of the marginalized in a way that hasn't been done before. And then third, the shift of the regime from mitigation to adaptation measures, but even beyond adaptation, we're now in this frame of consequences of failure to adapt. And really understanding that. And so the way that would be manifested, again, going forward into COP27 is really to emphasize climate finance. It's to emphasize losses and damages, and it's to emphasize development, but development also as a frame for conflict prevention and building human security in a more complicated world.
Thank you. Beatrice?
Okay, I believe that talk about climate change and global environmental issues through the lens of security can be helpful to highlight the importance and the urgency of the environmental problems, of course, without relying on exceptional and militarized measures. I think that putting climate change, I'm convinced that putting climate change and environmental problems in the top of the political agenda through the language of security can help to give voice to these marginalized populations in the global South. At least this is what I expect. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And almost the last word is Björn Olaus.
Well, thanks. Yes, we should not romanticize the Stockholm Conference, which is one of the topics today. It clearly had its limits, but I do think it provides some hope. We must remember that in 1967, it might have been seemed to be totally unrealistic, even naive, that to persuade the UN member states that the UN should address the environmental issues, and much less so believe that a UN meeting at this very divided UN at the time could deliver some significant results. But it did. It had three purposes: to increase awareness and understanding, to identify environmental aspects of joint international cooperation and give a common ground, a foundation and direction for the work. And it succeeded in all those three ambitions. And after that, we've seen, even though we've seen a lot of environment trends go the wrong way, a lot of social and economic trends go the wrong way, we still have about 300 new conventions, agreements and guidelines since then, and a progress on several important environmental issues. So, and today, even if we can be deeply troubled, so we are slowly, very slowly, but still starting to bend the carbon dioxide emission curve. And now finally, biodiversity seems to be more focused in world politics as well. So, and I think it's astonishing still that 50 years after Stockholm, we have all countries in the world agree that climate change is a serious problem, and they put pressure on each other to take new steps. So I'm certainly not content where we are today, but we might also recognize that now we are setting out and speeding up the pathways to decarbonization thanks to the agreements made in Glasgow. Hopefully, maybe I'm too optimistic here. But if we can see the same momentum on poverty, health, biodiversity, and human security, all things are not that bleak. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Björn Ola, and thank you to all of you, the panelists. Thank you also to the audience for watching. It's not possible, and I'm not going to try to sum up, but I think that a good landing point at the end was this thoughtful hope grounded in appreciation, a realistic appreciation of what has happened, what has been achieved, what the possibilities are. I think that we've emphasized the importance of voice and inclusion, and I think with that we've made sure that we understood and articulated that there is an undeniable and inescapable and necessary connection between the environmental issues and questions of power, politics, inequality, the shape of our societies. I think we've talked quite a lot about what kind of knowledge we need, what kind of thinking we need, creativity in the thinking and in the forms of expression. And I think that we've talked also about this, maybe this is the dilemma, the challenge perhaps, rather than dilemma, that we take away with us. How do we think about this in a way which understands and responds to the immediacy of the crisis that we face, and yet goes beyond crisis thinking, beyond putting a finger in the dike, beyond plugging the leak, into actually resolving, which means also transformational change. So with that, I leave you. Thank you very much again to Mistra Geopolitics and to Stockholm Environmental Institute for cooperating in this. You can see a nicely edited version of it online in a week or two, I expect. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and goodbye.